Hey guys! Tonight we drift back in time to a world where royal crowns weren't just heavy with gold, they were sloshing with the sound of liquid, frothy, intoxicating delight. Picture yourself stepping into the throne rooms of Mesopotamia or the palaces along the Nile, where jars of beer and wine stood tall as symbols of power, offerings to gods and coping mechanisms for long, dusty days of rule. The air is warm. Torches sputter against clay walls, and you can almost smell the tang of barley fermenting in vats. You probably won't survive this place because in truth, your liver would wave the white flag faster than any conquered army. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander into ancient Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, where kings didn't just invent writing and taxes, they also perfected beer, clay tablets, some scratched with cuneiform over 5,000 years ago, list recipes for brewing. Imagine a royal feast, the king seated on a raised platform, his nobles sprawled nearby, each sipping through long straws from a communal pot of thick, porridge-like beer. It sounds gross until you realize, without refrigeration, straws were a clever way to avoid chunky bits of grain. Historians still argue whether these gatherings were more about politics or plain partying, but it's clear alcohol was a glue, holding court society together. The Egyptians soon followed suit, turning beer into something closer to liquid bread. You trudge along a sun-baked path to the temple storehouses, where rows of amphorae rest in cool shadows for pharaohs. Beer wasn't just a luxury, it was a daily staple. Even pyramid builders were paid partly in beer rations, meaning that the monuments you see today were quite literally constructed by men sloshed enough to make the work bearable. And when pharaohs hosted their grand banquets, rivers of beer and imported wines flowed like offerings to both gods and egos. You picture Queen Cleopatra, draped in linen, reclining as musicians pluck harps, while servants pour wine sweetened with honey. Some sources hint she loved her nightly goblet of imported Greek vintage, though scholars debate whether that image comes from propaganda by her Roman enemies. Still, the thought of Rome mocking her decadence with one hand while guzzling barrels themselves feels deliciously hypocritical. Across the desert winds, another curious detail surfaces: beer doubles as medicine. Ancient Egyptian physicians prescribed it for stomach aches, childbirth, and even warding off demons. Imagine showing up with a broken arm and being handed a frothy pint. Fringe, definitely. Effective? Maybe not. But it shows that, for ancient royals, alcohol wasn't just a party drink, it was stitched into the very fabric of daily and divine life. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamian myth, the goddess Ninkasi presided over brewing. Her name still remembered through fragments of a hymn, praising the art of making beer. You can almost hum along, words floating like bubbles. Beer was divine, and to drink was to share in the gods' gifts. The kings knew this well, using drink as proof of their closeness to heaven. Sip enough, they thought, and maybe you'd touch eternity, or at least feel like it. But of course, not everyone was impressed. One Babylonian text warned that a king who drank too much might forget his duties, letting justice slip like water through careless fingers. Even back then, there was an unspoken rule: one goblet makes you charming, to make you forgetful, and 3 might lose you the throne. You chuckle, nothing's changed much, except maybe the brands. And here's a quirky tidbit: Egyptian beer wasn't golden like the lagers you see today. It was dark, cloudy, and thick, more like a soupy smoothie than a crisp pint. Close your eyes, take a sip, and you're chewing as much as drinking. Imagine the pharaoh, ruler of millions, pausing mid-banquet to spit out a grain husk stuck in his teeth. Somehow, the divine aura dims just a little. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra truly threw massive drinking parties in imitation of Dionysian feasts, or if the stories were spun later by jealous Roman chroniclers eager to paint her as decadent. But whether myth or truth, the gossip alone reveals how closely tied a ruler's reputation was to their relationship with Alcohol. So here you are, standing in flickering lamplight, watching Mesopotamian kings sip through straws in Egyptian. Queens sip from golden cups. The thrones may differ, the crowns may shine differently, but the common hum underneath is the same. Rule is heavy, but drink makes it lighter, even if only for a night. And already the pattern is clear. Where there's power, there's usually a goblet not far away. You shuffle your feet across marble floors now, slipping from sandy riverbanks into the polished symposia of ancient Greece. The air is thick with incense, the low strum of a lyre echoing against painted walls, and the ever-present smell of fermented grapes. Wine here isn't just a drink, it's the center of philosophy, the tool of politics, the spark for arguments that still shape how you think about life today. You lower yourself onto a couch beside a noble, and before you know it, a servant pours you a deep red that stains your lips faster than you can say Socrates. The Greeks prided themselves on turning drinking into a ritual. At a symposium, men lounged on couches, mixing their wine with water in large craters. Yes, they watered it down not because they were weak, but because the stuff was strong enough to send you face first into the floor. If you dared drink it pure, the ritual of dilution itself was a marker of civilization. To drink wine straight, in Greek eyes, was barbaric. You probably wouldn't last one round without slipping from philosopher to fool. And here's where the gods joined in. You glance at a painted amphora, and there's Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and chaos lounging with vines curling around his staff. Historians still argue whether Dionysian cults were respectable religion or wild excuses for massive, drunken parties. Either way, kings and city leaders drew on that imagery. When a ruler raised a cup, he wasn't just toasting the guests, he was aligning himself with divinity, claiming he held sway over joy, madness, and inspiration. You think of Alexander the Great, who drank as ferociously as he conquered. One account tells of a drinking contest he held in Persia. Dozens of men competed, gulping down wine in heroic quantities. The winner, he died 2 days later from alcohol poisoning. Alexander himself drank so much he sometimes blacked out, and scholars debate whether his sudden death at 32 was partly due to illness, or his liver finally staging a rebellion. Still, his followers saw his wine-soaked feasts as proof of his godlike vitality, not weakness. You can almost picture him, sweaty from battle, goblet raised high, daring the world to drink as deeply as he did. And then there's the quirky detail. Greek wine was favored. Honey, herbs, even bits of resin found their way into the crater. Imagine sipping what tastes like a mix of cough syrup and pine sap, while Plato drones on about the ideal form of justice. You cough politely, pretending to savor it, somewhere between the sweetness and the sting. You understand why the talk turned so lofty, only a buzzing mind could follow such logic. While choking down pine-flavored booze, women, mostly excluded from symposia, sometimes held their own private gatherings. The goddess Hera was said to have a special fondness for certain vintages, and myths tell of queens and noblewomen sneaking wine in private, away from prying male eyes. Historians still argue whether women in elite circles indulged more than the records admit, or whether the male chroniclers just wanted to keep the image of control intact. Either way, wine touched every corner of Greek life, public, private, sacred, and scandalous. There's even evidence of medical prescriptions, oddly echoing Egypt. The physician Hippocrates recommended diluted wine for digestion, fever, even wound cleaning. You grin at the thought of being patched up with a wine-soaked bandage. The doctor muttering, "It's good for morale." A practical antiseptic? Maybe. A sneaky excuse for the doctor to sip on the job? Almost certainly. Now, the music swells, and you can hear the laughter of Aristophanes echoing in the background. His plays poked fun at leaders who couldn't handle their wine, mocking them as buffoons in togas, stumbling through politics with wine stains down their robes. You can't help but laugh too, because the image is timeless. The clothes change, the goblets shift, but drunk rulers looking ridiculous? That's a story that never goes out of fashion, Dart, and so you recline deeper into the symposium couch, the red wine coating your throat, the air humming with philosophy, jokes, and faintly questionable resin flavor. The lesson sinks in Greece. Drink was never just about forgetting the world, it was about creating one. One sip tied you to gods, to kings, to philosophers, and to the belief that maybe, just maybe, the answers to life's greatest questions were waiting at the bottom of a cup. You stagger now into the marble and blood-scented halls of Rome, where emperors turned drinking into both spectacle and survival strategy. The Romans inherited wine culture from the Greeks, but in their hands. It became a weapon of empire, lavish, political, and dangerously intoxicating. The moment you step into a Roman banquet or convivium, you know you're in trouble. Reclining. Couches line the room, silver platters gleam, and slaves rush in with amphorae so large you wonder how anyone could lift them. And in the middle of it all, an emperor raises his cup like a scepter, proving that power and wine both flow endlessly in Rome. Take Emperor Nero, for example. You watch him recline with his infamous smirk, plucking at a lyre while gulping goblet after goblet of Falernian wine, one of the most prized vintages in Rome. Historians still argue whether Nero's supposed habit of performing while drunk, singing about the fall of Troy as Rome itself burned, was propaganda invented by his enemies or an actual booze-fueled disaster. Either way, the image stuck. A man so drenched in drink and ego that even catastrophe became a stage. And then there's the Emperor Tiberius, who retreated to Capri late in life. Ancient gossip paints him as a man whose banquets spiraled into debauchery fueled by heavy drinking. One writer even nicknamed him Tiberius Cordius Maro, a cheeky pun meaning drinker of hot wine without water. Imagine being remembered by history with a roast about your drinking habits. You can almost hear the snickers of senators raising eyebrows at each goblet he drained. Wine itself was everywhere in Rome, flooding not just palaces but streets. By the 1st century CE, it was cheaper than clean water in some regions, which explains why everyone from slaves to senators drank it daily. But Roman nobles had a twist. They mixed their wine, not just with water, but with honey, spices even. Seawater. Yes, seawater. You sip, you gag, and you wonder if this is why senators often passed out mid-debate. And then there's Caligula. You shiver as he strides into the banquet, demanding loyalty oaths be sealed with wine. Some accounts claim he poured rivers of the stuff, then ordered ships loaded with barrels to stage drunken naval battles. Did it really happen? Historians still argue, but the thought of a ruler turning war into a booze cruise feels uncomfortably on brand for him. Quirky detail? Roman soldiers sometimes received wine rations mixed with vinegar and water, called ****. Far from luxurious, it was cheap, sharp, and hydrating. Think of it as the Gatorade of the legions. You imagine sweaty centurions chugging Posca, while, back in Rome, senators stumbled home reeking of spiced Falernian, to empires under one grape. But the emperor most infamous for outdrinking everyone might have been Lucius Verus. While Marcus Aurelius the philosopher king penned Stoic wisdom, his co-emperor Lucius supposedly preferred endless banquets. The contrast is striking. One man scribbling notes on discipline, the other burping into his goblet. You grin at the irony. Rome ruled the world with one sober hand and one very tipsy one. And yet, drinking wasn't just about indulgence. Romans saw it as a performance of status. A host's generosity was measured in overflowing cups, and an emperor's authority was cemented when he outlasted everyone at the table. To refuse a drink could be seen as an insult, maybe even treason. Imagine your boss insisting you drain another liter for the empire, and suddenly, the HR nightmare becomes clear. You notice how the banquet hall spins a little, laughter turning sharp, politics souring with every cup. Cicero once warned that a drunk leader couldn't guard the republic, but the warning went unheeded. Instead, emperors drowned themselves in spectacle, convinced their thrones floated safely atop vats of wine. And you're just trying not to spill on your borrowed toga. The pattern deepens. Rulers equated drinking with divine favor, political theater, and raw authority. Whether it killed them, ruined their reputations, or helped them bind followers in liquid loyalty. Wine was the bloodstream of Rome itself. and as the goblets clink and the torches burn low, you realize that in Rome, sobriety was the true scandal, not drunkenness. You shuffle forward again, leaving behind marble columns and slipping into smoky timber holes where the air reeks of sweat, roasted meat, and honey wine mead. The so-called barbarians of Europe, Germanic tribes, Celtic chieftains, and early medieval warlords made sure their kings and queens were rarely far from a brimming drinking horn. You can practically feel the sticky sweetness on your lips as a servant tips the curved horn into your hands, urging you to drink deep. Here, alcohol isn't just refreshment, it's storytelling, bragging, and legitimacy. A king without mead might as well not be a king at all. You hear voices echo in Old Norse and Gaelic, full of boasts about raids, battles, and glorious ancestors. The hall glows with torchlight, and the benches creak beneath warriors who pound fists in rhythm to the next tale. If Mesopotamian kings drank to touch the gods, these tribal rulers drank to remind their warriors of loyalty and shared blood. The quirky part: mead wasn't always easy to come by. Honey is precious, and entire raids were sometimes justified on the excuse of stealing it. Imagine kings plotting attacks not for land or gold, but to top up their booze reserves. Historians still argue whether certain legendary raids like those told in the Welsh Mabinogion were exaggerated tales of honey lust or serious economic motivations. Either way, the mead hall stood at the center of it all. You picture Attila the Hun, nicknamed the Scourge of God, feasting with allies and enemies alike. Sources claim he preferred moderation compared to his warlords, yet his court was drowned in mead and wine regardless, whether he himself drank lightly or not. The rivers flowing at his banquets kept power-balanced drinkers' diplomacy, a subtle reminder that peace and intoxication came from his hand. Then you glance northward. In Germanic tradition, kingship itself was ritually tied to drinking. At the start of a feast, the king lifted the sacred horn, offering the first toast to the gods or ancestors. Only after that could the warriors drink. You see the pattern. The king's authority trickled down with every drop of honey wine. Without that ritual toast, the whole hall would feel off, as if the glue of society itself hadn't set. Meanwhile, in Celtic Britain, legends swirl around warriors and queens, out drinking entire war bands. Queen Boudica, famous for leading rebellion against Rome, is sometimes imagined in folklore as storming into battle after draining hornfuls with her tribesmen. Is it truth? Historians still argue, but the persistence of these tales shows how deeply alcohol and leadership were entangled. Ferocity measured not just in blood spilled, but in cups emptied. And let's not skip the practical side. Mead, with its sugar and fermentation, was one of the safest drinks available in societies where clean water couldn't be trusted. You lift your horn, take a swig, and realize you're less likely to get sick than from a stream outside. Maybe that explains why warriors lived long enough to fight another day, even if they did so with a mild buzz. Another quirky tidbit: drinking. Horns weren't exactly practical. You can't set them down, so once someone pours, you're stuck until you finish. The result: more drunken boasts, fewer careful sips. It's basically history's version of a shot glass that never empties. Politely. And when kings wanted to prove their worth, they often drained massive horns in one go, sometimes fainting afterward, to the cheers of their followers. As you sit in the smoky hall, firelight flickering, you realize that these early European kings and queens weren't merely drinking for fun. They were weaving loyalty, myth, and identity with every horn passed around. The mead bound warriors into a brotherhood, tied rulers to gods, and made sure the sagas carried on. Without the drink, the hall would fall silent, the bonds loosen, the stories forgotten. And so you grip the sticky horn tighter, heartbeat quickening. You've survived Mesopotamian beer, Greek wine, Roman Phalonian, and now the honey-sweet haze of barbarian boasts. The lesson echoes wherever there's a crown. There's a cup not far behind. You drift onward, the smoky mead halls fading as you find yourself walking beneath glittering mosaics and golden domes. The air smells faintly of incense and salt from the nearby sea. You're in Byzantium now, the empire that saw itself as Rome's rightful heir. Here, emperors wore purple robes, dined off silver plates, and yes, poured wine into goblets so ornate they looked like miniature thrones themselves. The flicker of oil lamps reflects off walls covered in shimmering saints. But down in the palace kitchens, vats of strong vintages bubble away, ready to loosen tongues in council chambers. Byzantine emperors loved their wine almost as much as their theology. Court banquets, or asterisk symposia, asterisk, a word carried over from Greece, were designed to impress foreign ambassadors. You picture Emperor Justinian seated beside Empress Theodora, watching guests gasp as servants brought out gold-plated jugs of wine sweetened with spices and honey. Every sip was a performance, proof that the empire still rivaled its Roman ancestors in wealth and taste. Historians still argue whether some of these feasts were exaggerated in later chronicles to glorify the empire, or whether the opulence truly reached such dizzying heights. And here's a curious quirk. Byzantines experimented with mulled wines. Centuries before medieval Europe popularized it. You raise a goblet, and the warmth of cinnamon, cloves, and pepper hits your nose. It's winter in Constantinople. The Bosphorus winds cut through your cloak, but inside the palace, the drink radiates heat like a small hearth in your chest. You can see why emperors leaned on it, not just to keep warm, but to project an image of sophistication. But indulgence also carried risks. Michael III, later nicknamed the Drunkard, became infamous for staggering through ceremonies after drinking far too freely. One story paints him as hosting mock chariot races indoors while servants laughed nervously. Was it true? Historians still argue whether he was really such a lush or if later rivals tarnished his reputation to justify his assassination. Either way, his nickname stuck like a wine stain on silk. Meanwhile, religious tension added another layer. Christianity frowned upon excess, yet wine was central to the Eucharist. For emperors, this meant threading a delicate line, drinking enough to symbolize divine blessing, but not so much that the patriarch wagged a finger at them. You watch a procession robe swish, choirs chant, and the emperor raises a chalice that is half sacrament, half celebration. You wonder, was he whispering prayers or just thinking about the after-party? Here's a quirky tidbit you probably didn't expect. Byzantine physicians recommended wine as a cure for melancholy, fainting, even snake bites. One recipe involved mixing wine with powdered pearls. You take a sip, crunch unexpectedly, and immediately regret it. Clearly, the imperial pharmacy doubled as a sommelier's nightmare. Foreign envoys often wrote about the drinking culture of Constantinople. Some praised the refinement, others mocked the excess. One Persian ambassador complained that Byzantine wine was far too sweet, cloying compared to the drier vintages back home. You smirk at the thought. Even in diplomacy, wine critics never sleep. And then there's the matter of court intrigue. Poisoning was a very real fear, and emperors sometimes had tasters drink before them. You imagine the poor servant lifting the jeweled goblet, praying the vintage was safe. Sometimes the paranoia even extended to elaborate drinking vessels with hidden compartments designed to let the emperor sip from one side while the other side sat untouched, just in case. As the golden light fades, you sense the contradiction. Byzantium dressed itself in piety, yet its courts echoed with clinking goblets and flushed faces. To rule here meant balancing sanctity with celebration, restraint with indulgence. To sober, and you risked seeming cold; to drunk, and you ended up as Michael the Drunkard. Forever remembered more for your cups than your crown. So you step back into the night air of Constantinople. The stars over the Bosphorus glinting like spilled pearls. In the distance, you hear laughter drifting from palace halls, proof that emperors, for all their sermons and splendor, couldn't resist the lure of the goblet. You step out of Constantinople's golden glow and find yourself wandering down a cobblestone path toward a looming stone abbey, its walls echoing with the sound of chanting monks. The scent of malt and hops drifts out from behind the cloister doors, and soon you realize this isn't just a place of prayer, it's a brewery. Monks, sleeves rolled up, stir massive vats of fermenting ale. humming psalms that sound oddly like pub songs if you squint your ears. And tucked away in the cellar, barrels stacked high await delivery not only to pilgrims but to kings who can't rule without their steady supply. Medieval monarchs depended heavily on monasteries for drink. Beer and ale were safer than water, and the monks were meticulous about their craft. You picture a king in a draughty castle, flagon in hand, sipping something brewed miles away by men in brown robes. Historians still argue whether some monasteries intentionally exaggerated their piety, just to maintain their lucrative brewing operations. But one thing is certain, royal households leaned on those cloisters like thirsty toddlers on juice boxes. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some abbeys had multiple grades of beer-strong brews for kings and nobles, lighter versions for monks, and the weakest small beer for peasants and children. Yes, even kids drank it daily, though at a low alcohol level. You glance at a medieval family breakfast table, toddlers sipping small beer like it's orange juice, while dad dreams of the stronger stuff saved for feast days. You realize quickly why kings preferred their personal casks. No monarch wanted to drink what the kids were slurping. Take Charlemagne, for example. He was known to regulate brewing standards across his empire, ensuring his nobles weren't shortchanged on quality. Picture him inspecting a foamy mug with the same seriousness he gave to military campaigns. Some sources suggest he even favored wine over ale, but still mandated beer's production for the good of his people. A ruler making sure everyone stayed buzzed? That's governance with a twist. And then there's King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, nicknamed the Drunkard King. He loved his ale so much that he'd personally tap barrels in his castle cellars. Chronicles describe him staggering through Prague's streets, stopping at taverns unannounced, and demanding mugs from stunned peasants. Historians still argue whether this image is exaggerated by hostile chroniclers or whether Wenceslas genuinely turned the whole kingdom into his personal pub crawl. Either way, he cemented Bohemia's brewing legacy. Of course, beer and wine weren't only about indulgence, they were also politics. Kings gifted casks to allies, bribed rivals with vintage barrels, and punished enemies by cutting off supplies. Imagine being exiled, not just from your homeland, but from its beer shipments. Brutal. And let's not forget the coronation banquets. Imagine Westminster Hall in England. Candles flickering, nobles jostling for a seat at the table, and massive barrels of ale rolled out like treasures. One English king supposedly ordered 10,000 gallons of wine for a single feast. You sip your mug and shake your head. You wouldn't survive the appetizer round, let alone dessert. Medicine still crept into. Medieval doctors prescribed ale mixed with herbs for fevers, childbirth, or melancholy. Was it effective? Maybe a placebo, but you can see why patients lined up eagerly. Take 2 pints and call me in the morning has a strangely enduring ring to it. The monks, of course, often preached moderation, but reality was messier. After all, if the king demanded barrels, who were they to argue? And so, abbeys churned out brew after brew, half breweries, half banks, supplying liquid wealth as much as liquid comfort. You picture the delicate balance, a monk with ink stained fingers in the scriptorium by day, a brewer stirring froth by night, both acts equally holy in their own way. The lesson unfolds clearly. Medieval kings weren't just fueled by faith, they were fueled by ferment. And without those monks in their cloisters hammering out both psalms and brewing schedules, royal thrones might have sat drier, duller, and far less merry. You raise your mug, taste the bitterness of hops, and let the echo of chanting monks fade into the night. In your ears, it almost sounds like laughter. The chanting monks fade away, and suddenly the air grows colder, saltier, as if the sea itself has blown straight through the doors of history. You're in a Viking mead hall now, long, smoky, rowdy, and vibrating with the clang of shields against wooden walls. Fire pits roar down the center, smoke curling into rafters darkened by centuries of feasts, and there she stands, a Viking queen, goblet in hand, her hair plaited in golden braids, pouring mead for warriors who hang on her every gesture. In Viking culture, queens often held the ceremonial role of cupbearers. It wasn't just serving drinks, it was a sacred act. weaving loyalty between king and war band. You watch Queen Gunhild, wife of Eric Bloodaxe, stride across the hall with a silver horn. She isn't some submissive servant. Every pause she makes is a reminder of her authority. Her role in legitimizing the feast. Historians still argue whether these stories inflate the power of women in the sagas, but the image of queens binding warriors through mead remains unforgettable. And what mead it was. Thick, golden, sweetened with honey and sometimes herbs, it packed a punch that could knock even the sturdiest warrior flat. You sip it, and it tastes both cloying and fiery, warming your belly while making your head spin. Quirky detail. Some sagas mention that mead was so prized it was sometimes stored in ship burials, meant to accompany rulers into the afterlife. Picture rowing into Valhalla, flagon already full, because eternity is way too long to be sober. You catch a bard beginning a story, his voice rising above the drunken shouts. The sagas themselves were often recited in these halls, stories of Odin, Thor, and past kings. And always, drinking was central. Odin himself was tied to mead. The mythical mead of poetry supposedly granted wisdom and inspiration. You can almost see the irony, slurred words in smoky halls echoing divine wisdom. Or maybe just very bad karaoke. But these feasts weren't just for fun. They were politics in liquid form. Kings cemented loyalty by sharing mead, and warriors proved their devotion by drinking until they collapsed. Archaeological finds of drinking horns carved with runes suggest that every sip was more than a gulp, it was a promise. You feel the weight of the horn in your hands, heavy and impossible to put down. And suddenly you understand why loyalty here was as intoxicating as the drink itself. Yet, not every Viking leader handled it well. Some sagas warn against kings who drank too deeply, letting their judgment falter. One tale hints that Harald Hardrada, before becoming king of Norway, nearly lost crucial alliances during a mead-soaked feast. Historians still argue whether the details are true or saga embellishment, but the lesson feels timeless, even in Valhalla's waiting room. Too much mead could wreck your chances. And here's another oddity. Vikings sometimes mixed mead with fruit or herbs, turning it into a primitive cocktail. Imagine sipping raspberry-infused mead while warriors argue over battle tactics. Suddenly, it doesn't feel so different from a modern bar where football fans squabble over who's the better team. You glance around the hall again, firelight flickering across furs and iron. The queen raises her horn, toasts the gods, and the hall erupts in cheers. Your own head spins, the buzz of honey wine mingling with the booming of voices. And you realize something striking. In this world, drinking isn't a side note. It's central to kingship, queenship, myth, and memory. Without the mead, there is no hall, no loyalty, no saga to be remembered. So you wipe honey from your lips, steady yourself against the carved beam of the longhouse, and let the roaring laughter of Vikings carry you out into the icy night. In the distance, you swear. You hear the faint crash of waves and the clink of another horn being filled. You stumble out of the smoky longhouse, and the chill of the north gives way to perfumed breezes and glittering fountains. You're at Versailles now, wandering through endless corridors of mirrors and chandeliers where even the air feels gilded. Servants glide across marble floors carrying trays not of water, but of wine, champagne, claret, and brandy by the gallon. For French kings, drink wasn't just pleasure, it was theatre, a daily performance of wealth so dazzling that no rival could doubt their supremacy. Take Louis XIII first. He set the stage with elaborate feasts, where nobles sipped Bordeaux until their tongues grew loose with gossip. But his son, Louis XIV, the Sun King, turned it into a golden age of guzzling. His banquets, called Grand Couvert were public spectacles. Imagine him seated under glittering chandeliers, every forkful watched by hundreds, every sip a political statement. Servants poured wine not just into goblets but sometimes into fountains outside, letting nobles stroll through gardens where literal rivers of alcohol flowed. Historians still argue whether the fountains really spouted champagne, or if later writers embellished. But the rumor itself was enough to cement Versailles as the capital of intoxicated opulence. And the quirky detail, Champagne itself became famous thanks to French royals. Monks in Champagne, yes, Dom Perignon perfected sparkling wine, but it was royal endorsement that made it the drink of choice. You raise a glass, bubbles tickling your nose, and realize this is the very fizz that crowned France's image of elegance. Yet early champagne was unstable, bottles often exploding in cellars. Picture Louis XIV pouring a toast while praying the cork didn't shoot across the table and chip a priceless mirror. Of course, drinking wasn't always smooth. Louis XV adored wine-soaked evenings with mistresses, often sneaking away from stiff, court rituals to indulge in more private revels. He reportedly enjoyed champagne so much that courtiers scrambled to secure vintages from his favored regions. Politics, pleasure, and vineyards blurred together, alliances sealed as easily as bottles uncorked. Marie Antoinette, later queen, is often remembered for her excess, though much of it comes from scandalous propaganda. Some stories even claim champagne glasses were modeled after her bosom, though historians still argue whether this was fact or 18th century satire. Either way, her image became entwined with the idea of reckless luxury and endless toasts, an image that didn't serve her well when revolution came knocking. And here's the political edge. While nobles swam in fountains of wine, peasants starved, fueling anger that bubbled hotter than any champagne. By the late 18th century, pamphlets mocked royal indulgence, describing feasts where goblets clinked as bread riots raged outside. You picture Versailles glittering like a jewel box, while Paris smoldered in hunger, a contrast sharper than any hangover. The French court even had a designated officer of wine, tasked with ensuring the king's goblet was never empty and never poisoned. Imagine that job description: must taste gallons daily, risk sudden death, maintain composure in powdered wig. Quirky and terrifying in equal measure. By the time of Louis XVI, indulgence turned fatal. His court still poured rivers of claret, but the tide of revolution made the spectacle intolerable. Wine that once symbolized power now symbolized arrogance. When mobs stormed Versailles, they mocked the drunken parties of the past, turning every spilled drop into a symbol of royal decay. As you step into the Hall of Mirrors, your reflection swims in candlelight and gilded glass. A servant offers you champagne, bubbles rising like tiny stars, and for a moment you taste both brilliance and downfall in the same sip. French kings and queens drank, as if intoxication itself could shield them from reality, but history shows that no amount of sparkling rivers could drown the tide of revolution. The lesson settles on your tongue like fizz gone flat. Excess is intoxicating, but it's also dangerous. And at Versailles, where fountains may or may not have poured champagne, crowns glittered brightest just before they shattered. You step away from Versailles glitter and find yourself trudging across muddy English ground, where the smell of roasting meat and spilled ale hits you before you even reach the Tudor court. Inside Hampton Court Palace, Henry VIII waits broad, red-faced, and already halfway through a tankard bigger than your head. This is a king who didn't just drink. He practically swam in beer. His court consumed barrels by the week, and his appetite for both food and drink became as legendary as his temper. Henry VIII's favorite drink, strong ale. Records show his household brewed nearly 600,000 gallons a year to supply the court. You do the math and realize that's enough to drown a small town. Servants rolled casks through palace halls, pouring endlessly for courtiers and visiting dignitaries. Wine was reserved for special occasions, but ale was daily fuel. Historians still argue whether Henry drank as heavily as the numbers suggest, or whether the court collectively absorbed the gallons. Either way, the man himself developed a beer belly so infamous it became shorthand for his reign. Quirky tidbit: Henry VIII once banned the export of hops because he thought hopped beer was a wicked and pernicious weed. He preferred his ale unhopped, sweeter and thicker, even if it spoiled faster. Imagine the king glaring at your pint and declaring it unfit for royal lips. Meanwhile, Europe was embracing hops for longer shelf life, proving Henry's stubbornness wasn't just about wives it extended to brewing too. Feasts at Henry's court were spectacles of gluttony. You slip into the great hall, long tables grown under roasted boars, venison pies, and puddings, all washed down with gallons of ale. Trumpets blare, jesters joke, and courtiers cheer as the king toasts yet again. Henry raises his tankard high, his face glowing pink, and you wonder how many gallons it takes before royal judgment blurs. Politics seeped into the mug as well. When Henry wanted to impress ambassadors, he showed off with banquets that lasted for hours, often challenging them to drink alongside him. Outdrinking a king wasn't just dangerous to your liver, it was dangerous to your career. Imagine refusing another round when the monarch himself insists. You'd risk being labeled untrustworthy or worse, disloyal. But there's a darker side. As Henry aged, his health deteriorated and alcohol only made it worse. Chronic leg ulcers, obesity, and gout plagued him. Some scholars debate whether his heavy drinking worsened his decline or whether he turned more to the goblet as pain relief. Either way, by the end, the once vigorous king was swollen and immobile. Propped up with goblets in hand, his indulgence written across his body like a warning. And here's a curious note. His daughter Mary Tudor inherited a fondness for wine, while Elizabeth preferred it diluted with water, suggesting the Tudor palate leaned boozy across generations. Maybe it ran in the blood, or maybe ruling England just demanded a strong drink. You lean against the cold stone of Hampton Court, the roar of feasting echoing through the halls. Servants carry yet another barrel past you, muttering about how the cellars never stay full for long. The thought is staggering, ruling a kingdom, waging wars, breaking with Rome, and somehow still making time to drain tankards like a tavern regular. Henry's story proves the pattern you've seen already. Kingship and drink are inseparable. But in his case, it wasn't just indulgence, it was identity. To be Henry VIII was to be loud, larger than life, and always, always thirsty. And as you watch him slam down another empty tankard, you realize England's fate rested in hands, often sticky with ale. You slip out of Hampton Court, brushing past barrels stacked high, and find yourself stepping into another English hall, though this one hums with a different energy. Queen Elizabeth I presides here, sharp-eyed and quick-witted, her goblet gleaming, as brightly as a jeweled gown. Unlike her father Henry VIII, she didn't guzzle ale until her seams burst, but she was no stranger to drink. Wine flowed steadily in her court, and Elizabeth wielded it as both refreshment and weapon, balancing sharp wit with the swirl of a goblet in hand. Elizabeth's taste leaned toward wine often imported from France, Spain, or Italy. Chronicles suggest she especially enjoyed sweet sack, a type of fortified sherry. You raise a cup yourself and find it rich, strong, and warming, the kind of drink that lingers like a royal command. Historians still argue whether she drank heavily or whether stories of her consumption were inflated by enemies eager to tarnish her image. But what's certain is that wine was a staple of her daily life, as common to her table as bread. One quirky tidbit: Elizabeth reportedly drank ale every morning, sometimes flavored with a dash of wine. Breakfast beer might sound bizarre now, but in the 16th century, it was safer than water and packed enough calories to start the day. Imagine the Queen sipping her morning pint, then heading to council to spar with advisers. Before Parliament, one must hydrate, you mutter, raising your own imaginary goblet. But Elizabeth wasn't just drinking, she was performing. Her banquets became theatres of politics. She sparred verbally with ambassadors, her wit sharpened by a sip of sack. At times, she even staged contests of eloquence, where courtiers were expected to toast her with elaborate speeches. A clever quip delivered mid-toast could secure favour. A stammering reply might doom a career. You can almost feel the pressure standing before her hawk-like gaze, wine warming your cheeks as you try not to make a fool of yourself. Yet moderation was part of her image. Elizabeth cultivated the reputation of being in control, never enslaved. By her cup, unlike her father, she didn't want to be remembered as a monarch whose belly came first. Still, whispers circulated. Some gossip that she relied on drink more as she aged, particularly as her health faltered. Historians debate whether her famous temper, the fiery outbursts, the sudden mood swings owed anything to a few too many goblets. But the truth as always, is slippery at the bottom of the cup. And then there's the peculiar connection between Elizabeth and pirates. Yes, pirates. During her reign, privateers like Francis Drake brought back barrels of plundered Spanish wine. The Queen, ever practical, made use of the spoils, toasting victories with the very drink taken from her enemies. You grin at the thought. Nothing says cheers quite like sipping your rival's best vintage after raiding their ships. Wine was also folded into ritual. At Elizabeth's coronation, as with many monarchs, fountains flowed with wine for the people. Citizens of London crowded around, cups in hand, as rivers of alcohol poured in celebration of their new queen. Picture the scene, the city buzzing with drunken joy, and Elizabeth herself knowing that her crown began with a public toast. Of course, there's a fringe detail worth savouring. Elizabeth's teeth were famously stained black from her sweet tooth, and some suggest her wines, often fortified and sugary, contributed to the decay. You picture the Queen, dazzling in pearls, smiling wide with wine-darkened teeth, and realize power doesn't erase the little embarrassments of excess. In the end, Elizabeth turned drinking into another tool of her reign. She never let it eclipse her intellect or her politics, but she understood its role in spectacle, diplomacy, and daily ritual. You sip your sack, feel its warmth coil in your stomach, and imagine yourself seated at her table half terrified, half dazzled, trying to keep up with the Virgin Queen's wit as the candles burn low, and the goblets never quite empty. You leave Elizabeth's candlelit table and stumble into the echoing marble halls of Imperial Russia, where the winter night presses hard against the windows. Inside, warmth radiates from roaring hearths, and glasses of vodka glitter like tiny fires in the hands of courtiers. Catherine the Great presides here, sharp as a saber, every bit the autocrat, yet surrounded by an atmosphere steeped in endless toasts, drinking games, and rituals that would flatten most modern livers in a single evening. Vodka was Russia's liquid crown jewel, and Catherine wielded it as both a diplomatic weapon and personal indulgence. Feasts in her court were spectacles of glass raising. Guests toasted Catherine's health, her armies, her empire, and sometimes, seemingly, the wallpaper. You take a sip of the fiery spirit, and it burns down your throat like a winter wind through an open steppe. By the third glass, you wonder how anyone still managed to walk straight. Historians still argue whether Catherine herself matched her court drink for drink, or whether she cleverly sipped lighter versions while letting her guests collapse in loyalty drunk heaps. Here's a quirky tidbit. Russian drinking rituals often demanded that no glass be left unfinished. Once a toast was raised, the cup had to be drained. You can picture a noble wobbling on his feet, eyes watering as he choked. Down yet another brimming glass, while Catherine's sharp eyes watched for who could endure and who faltered. Survival in her court required both a strong liver and a stronger sense of timing. Some accounts suggest Catherine introduced structured drinking etiquette rules about how toasts should be made and in what order. It sounds civilized, but when each toast comes with a full glass of vodka, structure only goes so far. You imagine a guest on his 15th toast, head swimming, still expected to stand and deliver eloquent praise of the Empress. One slip of the tongue, one garbled word, and his career or maybe even his life might be at stake. And then there's the wild all-night drinking club, founded by Peter the Great, Catherine's predecessor. He created it as a parody of religious brotherhoods complete with robes, rituals, and endless drinking bouts. Though Catherine didn't invent it, she inherited the culture it left behind. The club's notorious marathons of vodka consumption echoed through Russian high society for generations, making heavy drinking almost a badge of elite status. Imagine earning your promotion by proving you could stay conscious after 50 toast sits, like a fraternity hazing with far deadlier stakes. But Catherine wasn't reckless. She was pragmatic, and her relationship with alcohol reflected that. She enjoyed wine as well as vodka, particularly European imports, and often used them to charm foreign ambassadors. At banquets, she positioned herself as hostess and ruler, always in control, always able to outwit and perhaps outdrink her guests. Historians debate whether her nightly routines really involved the heavy drinking, some gossipy courtiers claimed, or whether her enemies exaggerated her indulgence to paint her as decadent. And here's a fun, fringe detail: Catherine's court sometimes flavored vodka with exotic ingredients like horseradish or pepper. Imagine choking down a glass of horseradish vodka, eyes watering, while trying to deliver a toast about the greatness of the empire. You'd almost rather face the Siberian winter outside. Yet for all the drinking, Catherine knew when to stop. She understood that the goblet was a tool of statecraft, a way to bind nobles to her rule still. The image of her palace, echoing with laughter, hiccups, and stumbling footsteps, remains as much a part of her legacy as her military reforms and expansion of empire. You stand now in the flickering candlelight, glass in hand, the room buzzing with drunken nobles praising their empress. Catherine sits regal, her smile half amused, half calculating, watching as loyalty dissolves into slurred devotion. For her, vodka was more than a drink, it was power, distilled and poured straight into the veins of her empire. The frosty Russian night melts away, and now you're back in France, stepping into the gilded blaze of Louis XIV's Versailles. The Sun King himself waits, draped in brocade, a goblet of Burgundy clutched like a scepter. Round him, nobles jostle, chandeliers drip gold light, and the sheer excess of food and wine feels almost blinding. If Catherine's vodka was sharp and punishing, Louis's wine was lush, endless, and meant to drown everyone in awe. Louis XIV didn't just drink. He staged drinking. His feasts were deliberate theatre, political tools designed to remind nobles of their dependence on his generosity. Picture the Grand Couvert, the king eating in front of an audience, surrounded by fountains of wine and tables piled with venison, oysters, pastries, and gilded goblets. Even his private meals were semi-public, designed to display his magnificence. Historians still argue whether the volumes of alcohol served, sometimes recorded in the tens of thousands of bottles per year, were consumed entirely by the court, or padded in reports to inflate the grandeur. Either way, the symbolism was unmistakable. Drink was monarchy, bottled. And here's a quirky detail: Louis had a famously delicate stomach, yet he indulged in rich wines regardless. Sometimes he diluted them heavily with water, but he made sure the spectacle of abundance never faltered. Imagine a king sipping watered-down Burgundy while everyone else pretends not to notice, too busy guzzling vintage after vintage. Even moderation had to masquerade as excess. The court's drinking habits were notorious. Nobles competed to prove their loyalty through toasts, and being invited to share wine at the king's table was one of the highest honors. You sip from a crystal glass and realize that every swallow here is a test. Drink too little, you look aloof. Drink too much, you look ridiculous. Balance is survival in Versailles. Louis also adored champagne, though it was still new and unstable. Early bottles often exploded, so cellars were dangerous places. Imagine dodging cork shrapnel like battlefield arrows. But when it worked, the sparkling fizz became another symbol of refinement, tied forever to the glittering image of his reign. The king's endorsement made champagne fashionable across Europe, turning a risky experiment into liquid prestige. And then there were the garden parties. The palace grounds became stages where alcohol flowed in fountains, sometimes tinted red, to mimic rivers of wine. Guests wandered drunkenly among marble statues, music echoing through the hedges. Historians still argue whether some of these more extravagant tales, like literal rivers of champagne, were exaggerations by dazzled visitors. But even the possibility tells you how much wine was woven into the myth of Versailles. Quirky tidbit: Louis XIV kept his own wine steward, whose job was to ensure not just quality but safety. Poisoning was a constant fear, so the steward tested everything first. Imagine having to taste test 100 glasses a day, your tongue permanently marinated in Burgundy. It was an honor and a nightmare. Yet drinking wasn't always safe for the king himself. By the later years of his reign, Louis suffered from numerous ailments, and alcohol only worsened them. Still, to stop drinking in public would have meant showing weakness, so the performances continued, goblets raised, nobles watching, the theatre of intoxication masking the pain of age, and you, standing beneath the chandeliers, feel the weight of the performance, the clinking glasses, the sparkling fountains. The endless toasts, it's dazzling, but also suffocating. Every swallow is scripted, every sip political, every drunken laugh carefully monitored. This isn't a party. It's governance by intoxication. So you set your empty glass on a gilded tray, step out into the manicured gardens and glance back at the glowing palace. Inside, nobles stumble, laugh and whisper while the Sun King beams at the center, his goblet raised like a miniature sun. In Versailles, wine wasn't just drink, it was light, power, and the illusion that excess could last forever. You leave behind Versailles glitter and follow the cold winds northward, where the scent of peat smoke and malted barley greets you before the sound of bagpipes. You're in Scotland now, the land where whiskey, the water of life, burns in the veins of kings and clans alike. Here, drinking isn't just indulgence, it's survival, tradition, and sometimes outright warfare. You can almost feel the sting of the first fiery sip as it sears your throat, the kind of heat that makes you believe you could charge straight into battle. Scottish kings leaned heavily on whiskey to bind their people. Feasts at royal courts were loud, smoky affairs, where barrels of whiskey were rolled out as symbols of both wealth and hospitality. James IV, for instance, was recorded purchasing large quantities of aqua vita in the late 15th century. That's whiskey in its early, rougher form, probably harsher than jet fuel, but prized all the same. Historians still argue whether these purchases were personal indulgence or meant for court distribution, but either way, whiskey was firmly tied to royal identity by then. And here's a quirky tidbit. Whiskey making was often overseen by monks before distilling spread to noble households. By the time kings adopted it, whiskey was as much a sacred brew as it was a royal one. Imagine priests carefully noting measurements, then passing the barrel on to a warlord who promptly used it to toast victory over his rivals. Holy water indeed. Whiskey also played into clan rivalries. You picture Highland chiefs presenting casks as gifts or as bribes to secure loyalty. Refusing a dram could be seen as an insult, while drinking deep proved trust. It wasn't unusual for feasts to spiral into full-blown brawls, whiskey fueling both courage and chaos. In one tale, a banquet ended with half the clan unconscious, the other half at each other's throats. Whether embellished or not, the story highlights whiskey's double edge. It united and divided with equal force. Royal figures weren't exempt from excess. Mary, Queen of Scots, grew up in France but reportedly adapted well to Scotland's harsher drink culture. Legends claim she enjoyed whiskey laced with honey, smoother, sweeter, easier to sip at long feasts. Was it her actual favorite, or just a later romantic detail? Historians still argue, but the image lingers, a queen balancing elegance with a fiery Highland dram. And then there's the Jacobite era. Supporters of the exiled Stuart kings often raised whiskey in clandestine toasts, their cups lifted to the king across the water. In smoky taverns, loyalty and rebellion fermented together, each dram both a drink and a declaration. You can almost hear the whispered toasts, cups clinking under candlelight, while spies lurked nearby. Quirky detail, early whiskey wasn't aged in barrels like today. It was often clear, raw and eye-wateringly strong. Imagine being offered a drink that felt more like swallowing a lit torch than sipping a refined spirit. Royal courts drank it anyway, partly because nothing else warmed you faster in a stone castle with draughts sneaking through every crack. By the 17th century, whiskey had become so tied to Scottish identity that English authorities tried to regulate and tax it. Naturally, this led to smuggling and secret stills hidden in the hills. You can see it now, a king's loyal subjects hauling barrels under moonlight, determined to keep their water of life flowing no matter what the crown in London decreed. So, here you are, sitting at a rough-hewn table in a Highland hall. The king raises his glass, the clans roar their approval, and you gulp down the burning whiskey that makes your eyes water and your chest blaze. The loyalty it inspires is undeniable, yet so is the risk of fights breaking out. Before the feast is done, the lesson stings your throat as much as the drink. In Scotland, whiskey wasn't just about pleasure. It was about power, loyalty, rebellion, and identity itself. Every fiery sip carried the weight of a kingdom's struggles, and sometimes it lit the fuse of war. The smoky highlands fade, and now you're wandering cobblestone streets that open into the grandeur of Vienna, capital of the Habsburg dynasty. Marble palaces loom above you, fountains splash, and the scent of roasted chestnuts mixes with something sweeter, the unmistakable aroma of imported wines. For the Habsburgs, rulers of a sprawling patchwork of kingdoms, drink was more than recreation. It was glue, binding together lands from Spain to Hungary, each vineyard pouring its loyalty into their goblets. You find yourself at a banquet in the Hofburg Palace. Chandeliers drip light onto long tables stacked with bottles. Tokaji from Hungary, Riesling from the Rhineland, sherry from Spain. The Habsburgs collected wines like trophies, showing off the sheer reach of their empire. Picture Emperor Charles V sipping Spanish sherry one night, and Hungarian sweet wine the next, proving with every swallow that his crown spanned continents. Historians still argue whether his heavy drinking worsened his famous jaw condition, the so-called Habsburg jaw. But one thing's certain: his dynasty drank as expansively as it ruled. Here's a quirky tidbit. Tokaji wine became so prized that Louis XIV of France supposedly called it the wine of kings, the king of wines. But it was the Habsburg court that really turned it into legend. Barrels of Tokaji flowed into Vienna, fueling gossip and diplomacy alike. Imagine sipping syrupy sweet wine so thick it clung to your lips, while courtiers whispered about who would marry whom to secure the next province. The Habsburgs were also notorious for marrying within their own family to keep power intact, and you can't help but wonder how much wine was needed to make those wedding banquets bearable. A toast to your cousin's spouse? Awkward, but unavoidable. By the 18th century, drinking in Vienna had become so entrenched that Empress Maria Theresa worried about the excess. She tried imposing taxes on taverns, hoping to curb both noble and peasant indulgence. Did it work? Hardly. If anything, smuggling and secret wine cellars multiplied. You picture peasants ducking into hidden courtyards, raising contraband mugs, while nobles laughed at laws over golden goblets. And then there's Emperor Leopold I, remembered not only for his piety, but also for his fondness for Italian wines. One story claims he hosted week-long feasts where barrels emptied faster than scribes could record. Historians still debate whether these accounts were exaggerations meant to flatter or embarrass him. Either way, the image of Leopold swaying gently on his throne, goblet in hand, fits the broader pattern of rulers who blurred piety with indulgence. Quirky detail: Vienna's court developed a taste for warm, spiced wines in winter, an ancestor of today's mulled wine. Imagine wandering through a palace courtyard lit with lanterns, cupping steaming mugs that smelled of cinnamon and orange peel. For the Habsburgs, even keeping warm was an excuse for another round. But drink was also diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors measured their success by the feasts they survived. To be offered the emperor's favorite wine was a sign of favor. To refuse was unthinkable. You can almost see a poor envoy from the Ottoman court grimacing through glass after glass, praying his stomach would hold out long enough to make his political pitch. And as dynastic portraits remind you, the Habsburgs weren't exactly known for moderation. Their swollen jaws and heavy eyes stare down from gilt frames, and you wonder how much of their sluggish, inbred decline was painted over by rivers of imported wine. Even at their weakest, the cellars never ran dry. So you stand in the glittering hall, candlelight bouncing off crystal goblets, the laughter of courtiers echoing as another cask is rolled in. The Habsburgs toast not just to themselves but to the empire, their glasses filled with vintages drawn from every corner they ruled. For them, alcohol was proof of power, a map you could taste, and as you sipped the syrupy Tokaji sticky on your lips, you realize this was an empire drunk not only on ambition, but on its own endless supply of wine. Vienna's golden halls dissolve, and suddenly you feel the deck beneath your feet rocking, the sea wind whipping your hair. Lanterns sway overhead, casting crooked shadows across a ship's deck crowded with sailors, treasure chests, and oddly enough a woman in a jeweled tiara gripping a bottle of rum. You've stumbled into the world of pirate queens where crowns were traded for cutlasses and liquor was as much a weapon as a reward. Take 'em Bonnie, the Irish-born pirate who sailed the Caribbean in the early 1700s. She wasn't technically a queen by blood, but she ruled her ship as fiercely as any monarch. Her authority enforced with a pistol in one hand and a bottle of rum in the other. Legends say she and fellow pirate Mary Read drank and fought alongside their male counterparts, their reputations swelling in taverns from Nassau to Port Royal. Historians still argue how much of their story was embellished by trial records hungry for scandal, but their association with rum-soaked bravado is undeniable. Here's a quirky tidbit. Pirates often watered their rum down with citrus juice to fight scurvy. This concoction became known as grog. Imagine a pirate queen handing out mugs of watered rum, ordering her crew to stay healthy while secretly sipping the undiluted stuff herself. It's both practical and slyly indulgent. Rum wasn't just a drink, it was currency. Captains rewarded loyalty with extra rations, and mutinies often broke out when supplies ran dry. You picture a queen standing at the helm, her ship stocked with barrels of plundered rum, every toast doubling as a paycheck. Even kings on land rarely wielded such direct, intoxicating power over their followers. And then there's Grace O'Malley, the Irish pirate queen, who commanded fleets and negotiated directly with Queen Elizabeth I. Stories claim she drank heartily with her men, her goblet slamming onto the table as she barked orders. Some sources say she even shocked Elizabeth by refusing to bow, her defiance fueled by pride and perhaps a little too much ale, whether she drank heavily or not. Her legend intertwines with feasting, seafaring, and barrels always close at hand. Quirky. Fringe detail. Some pirate codes explicitly banned drinking on duty, though they made up for it with wild binges on shore leave. So while the myth of constant drunkenness sails strong, reality may have been more measured at sea. Still, once docked, the floodgates opened. Taverns shook with songs, mugs slammed against wood, and pirate rulers, queens included, led the charge. What made these women different from kings and queens you've already met is how they're drinking. Blurred lines between nobility and rebellion. Instead of polished crystal and gilded banquets, their goblets were battered tankards. Instead of courtiers, they toasted with tattooed sailors. Yet the role of drink was the same. Authority flowed with liquor. Loyalty cemented in shared intoxication. You lean on the railing now, the ocean stretching black and infinite. Somewhere behind you, laughter erupts as another barrel is cracked open. The pirate queen raises her cup, the crew roars, and for a moment you realize crowns aren't always made of gold. Sometimes they're sticky with spilled rum, gleaming in lantern light as seawater sprays your face. And as the ship pitches into the night, you take your own swig, the fiery rum burning down like liquid rebellion. For these queens of the waves, alcohol wasn't just a drink, it was the lifeblood of freedom, mutiny, and fleeting rule over a world that rocked and swayed with every tide. The salty spray fades, and now you're back on dry land. In the quiet velvet-draped halls of Victorian England, the chandeliers here glow softer. The laughter is hushed, and there sits Queen Victoria herself, prim and proper in black silk, yet on the side table rests a crystal decanter of brandy. Despite her reputation as a stiff, moralizing monarch, Victoria harbored her own liquid indulgences, and her relationship with alcohol was more complicated and more human than many imagine. Victoria's daily routine often included alcohol. In measured doses, she reportedly enjoyed claret mixed with whiskey, a concoction that sounds like a hangover bottled in advance. Court gossip whispered that she favored a glass of brandy-laced wine before bed for her nerves. Historians still argue whether these habits were exaggerated by critics or faithfully recorded by close attendants. But the idea of the famously prim queen sipping brandy before tucking in adds a quirky twist to her severe image. One curious detail comes from Balmoral Castle, her beloved Scottish retreat, surrounded by Highland air and roaring fireplaces. Victoria supposedly developed a taste for whiskey. In fact, local distillers credited her patronage with helping popularize Scotch among the British upper classes. Imagine the Queen raising a glass of smoky single malt, her stern expression softening slightly, while Prince Albert looked on, probably pretending not to notice her third sip. Here's the quirky tidbit that really sparkles. Victoria adored a German wine called Hocker white Rhine wine, and it became fashionable in England largely because of her. Dinner parties across the country began stocking it, eager to imitate the Queen's palate. You glance around a Victorian dining hall, nobles sipping pale golden wine as if every drop were proof of loyalty. It's less dramatic than Viking mead or Russian vodka, but no less political. Victoria's taste for alcohol also played into her private grief. After Prince Albert's death, she famously retreated into mourning, her public image becoming one of somber restraint. Yet some accounts suggest she leaned more heavily on her evening brandy during these years. Was it genuine solace or just another exaggerated rumor? Historians still debate. What's undeniable is that the Queen who ruled half the globe was still human enough to find comfort at the bottom of a glass. And here's a fringe note that makes you chuckle. Victoria supposedly believed in brandy and egg as a tonic for health. A raw egg whisked into brandy and swallowed down. You take a sip in your imagination, gag immediately, and marvel at how anyone could claim it was medicinal. Yet Victorian doctors often recommended such concoctions, seeing alcohol as both stimulant and cure-all. Publicly, of course, Victoria embodied moderation. Temperance movements flourished during her reign, preaching abstinence and condemning drunkenness, especially among the working classes. But in royal circles, indulgence remained common, just more discreet. The Queen herself never projected a drunkard image, but the decanters in her drawing rooms told their own quieter story. So you sit now in the hushed glow of Balmoral, listening to the rain tapping at the windows. A maid pours a small glass of amber liquid and Victoria lifts it, her posture perfectly straight, her face unreadable. Was it habit, indulgence, or private rebellion against the rigidity of her public role? The truth lingers somewhere in the shadows of her palace halls. The lesson whispers to you softly. Not all rulers flaunted their drinking in fountains of champagne or horns of mead. Some, like Victoria, kept it tucked away in quiet glasses woven into daily life, almost invisible unless you looked closely. But whether shouted from banquet halls or sipped in private chambers, alcohol still flowed beneath the crown, shaping both image and reality. You leave Balmoral's rainy windows behind and drift eastward, the air warming with spices and the murmur of fountains. Now you're in the Ottoman Empire, strolling past tiled courtyards and perfumed gardens. At first, you think you won't find much drinking here. The Quran forbids alcohol, and the sultans were supposed to uphold Islamic law. But as you slip into the Topkapi Palace and glance behind silk curtains, you discover a different story. Rulers who bent or broke the ban, sipping forbidden wine in secret, sometimes at great risk. Take Sultan Selim II, nicknamed Selim the Salt. Chronicles describe him as so fond of wine he nearly drowned in a drunken mishap. One tale claims he slipped and cracked his skull after drinking too much during a bathhouse binge. Was it true, or just gossip from critics eager to slander him? Historians still argue, but the fact that his nickname survives tells you plenty. Even in an empire built on piety, drunkenness clung to the throne. Here's a quirky detail. Some sultans preferred fruit wines to strong spirits, disguising their indulgence as harmless refreshment. You picture a goblet of pomegranate wine passed discreetly during a palace feast, the sultan raising it to his lips while courtiers pretend not to notice. One chronicler even claimed Selim to favor the wines of Cyprus so much that he invaded the island, partly to secure them for his cellars. Was conquest really fueled by grapes? Maybe not. But the rumor lingers like a sour aftertaste. Life inside the harem also offered temptations. While the sultan's official image was sober, reports suggest that favored concubines and eunuchs sometimes joined in clandestine feasts, where laughter and music masked the clink of forbidden cups. Imagine carpets littered with golden goblets, silks stained with red wine, while musicians strummed lutes deep into the night. The tension between law and indulgence shaped Ottoman drinking culture. Coffee houses flourished as public alternatives, but behind palace walls, alcohol whispered. One story claims Sultan Murad IV went so far as to ban alcohol along with tobacco and coffee, and enforced it brutally, yet some whispered he still drank in private. The hypocrisy, if true, makes you raise an eyebrow. Historians still debate whether Murad's private indulgence was fact or slander, but the contrast between his bans and the temptations he faced paints a vivid picture of rule. Under pressure, quirky fringe tidbit, Ottoman physicians sometimes prescribed wine medicinally. Much like their European counterparts, a glass of spiced wine might be offered for digestion or melancholy. Of course, one man's prescription easily became another man's nightly habit. You chuckle, thinking of a sultan insisting, "It's for my health," while draining another goblet. Alcohol even figured into diplomacy. European envoys, accustomed to lavish wine feasts, often misinterpreted Ottoman restraint. When wine was offered at select palace banquets, it sent a clear message: this is special. You are honored, but don't breathe a word outside. Imagine the nervous ambassador, sipping carefully, knowing both indulgence and refusal carried political risks. As you lean against a carved wooden screen, you feel the contradictions, the empire outwardly sober, yet its rulers sometimes privately intoxicated. Power and piety collided in every sip, and the throne itself wobbled on the edge of both devotion and temptation. The lesson sinks in like sweet pomegranate wine. Even when banned, alcohol found its way into royal veins. For the sultans, the goblet wasn't just forbidden fruit, it was a reminder that even absolute rulers live under laws they sometimes couldn't resist breaking. The tiled courtyards of Topkapi fade, and suddenly you hear boots striking cobblestones, drums rolling, and the clink of mugs echoing through Prussian barracks. You've marched into the land of Frederick William I, the so-called soldier king, where discipline ruled the army but beer ruled the men. In Prussia, kings weren't remembered just for their military reforms. They were remembered for guzzling lager and expecting their troops to do the same. Frederick William I was famous for his frugality, yet paradoxically, his court drank oceans of beer. Wine was seen as too French, too decadent, but beer, that was patriotic, hearty, and properly German. You picture the king slamming down a heavy stein, froth splashing across his uniform as he barked out orders for the next day's drills. Historians still argue whether he really drank to excess himself or just kept pace with his soldiers. But either way, alcohol was woven into the fabric of Prussian identity. And here's a quirky tidbit: Frederick William ran what he called his topic schologum the tobacco cabinet. It wasn't really about tobacco. It was a club of generals and advisors who gathered to smoke pipes, drink prodigious amounts of beer, and make decisions somewhere between genius and chaos. Imagine policy debates drowning under rivers of lager interrupted by coughing fits and the clatter of mugs. Some historians call it an informal council. Others call it the world's rowdiest think tank. His son, Frederick the Great, took things in a different direction. He preferred champagne and fine French wines, even as his father raged about decadence. The contrast is almost comical. One king hammering the table with a stein, the next swirling a crystal flute like a Parisian aristocrat. You can almost hear Frederick William muttering from beyond the grave, "Ungrateful boy," as Frederick the Great toasted Voltaire with imported bubbles. But for the rank and file, beer was more than a treat. Soldiers were paid partly in rations. Of it, their loyalty foamed into their mugs. Refusing a drink might be seen as weakness, while downing pint after pint proved your worth as a Prussian man. One anecdote claims that whole regiments would drink before battle, the froth still on their lips as they marched into musket fire. Was it courage or foolishness? Historians still debate, but the myth of beer-fueled bravery endures. Another quirky detail: early Prussian military manuals sometimes mention beer as part of daily logistics. Bread, bullets and barrels of beer moved together as essential to war as powder and shot. You imagine a supply officer carefully noting, to crates of musket balls, 3 barrels of rye bread and most important 10 kegs of lager, beer. Even shaped public life. Taverns doubled as recruiting stations, with sergeants plying young men with free mugs before pressing them into service. In a way, the Prussian army was built as much on hops and barley as on drills and discipline. The soldier king's reputation for drinking carried risks too. Chroniclers joked about his temper worsening after a few too many steins, and some even suggested policy decisions were made in drunken fits. Were those tales slander, or truth sloshing over the rim? Historians still argue, but the very fact that the story's spread shows how closely his rule was tied to the mug. So, you find yourself in a smoky Berlin tavern, wooden beams groaning overhead, steins clattering as songs rise from throats thick with beer. The king himself might appear at any moment, broad-shouldered, red-faced, demanding loyalty and another round. For the Prussians, beer wasn't just drink, it was duty. It marched with the soldiers, echoed in the barracks, and foamed across the crown itself. And as you drain your stein, you realize the truth. Some kings built empires on law, others on fear. In Prussia, they built it on lager-thick, hearty, and endless as the marches of their armies. The smoky Prussian taverns fade, and suddenly the night air feels softer, tinged with the scent of rice and cherry blossoms. Lanterns glow in quiet courtyards, and a hush falls as you step into a Shinto shrine where cups of clear sake gleam like moonlight. In lacquered bowls, you've crossed into Japan, where emperors descendants of the sun goddess herself drank not just for pleasure, but as part of sacred ritual. Here, intoxication wasn't simply indulgence. It was a bridge between mortals and the divine. Sake, brewed from fermented rice, had been at the center of Japanese court life for over 1,000 years. In imperial banquets, the emperor would sip the first cup before passing it to courtiers, binding the act of drinking to both hierarchy and sanctity. You picture the Hionera court, nobles in silk robes kneeling as golden cups are filled, the fragrance of warm sake rising like incense. Historians still argue whether the emperor himself drank deeply or symbolically, but the ritual mattered more than the quantity. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sake was sometimes served not in cups, but in hollowed-out gourds or even seashells. Imagine lifting a delicate scallop shell brimming with rice wine, trying not to spill it down your robe as you toast the emperor's health. One clumsy move, and you've stained your dignity along with your sleeves. But sake wasn't just ceremonial. It was woven into seasonal festivals like New Year's and cherry blossom viewings, where nobles and eventually commoners toasted beneath blooming trees. Emperors often joined or presided over these rituals, blending the lines between ruler and reveler. Picture a Hanomi feast, petals drifting into cups, laughter floating through the spring air, and a ruler proving his closeness to both nature and people with every sip. Yet excess carried risks. Some chronicles whisper of emperors who indulged too much, their judgment clouded by rice wine. Emperor Soga in the 9th century is said to have enjoyed sake so heavily that court edicts were delayed, though historians still argue whether this was fact or exaggeration by critics. Either way, the idea of imperial scrolls waiting because the emperor was nursing a hangover is both amusing and a little too believable. Sake also carried medicinal weight. Ancient texts recommended it for everything from digestion to easing childbirth. You chuckle at the thought of a royal physician prescribing 3 cups of sake daily, with the same seriousness as modern antibiotics. And with sake often brewed stronger than beer, you suspect the placebo effect came with more staggering than healing. Another quirky detail. In Shinto belief, drunkenness itself could be divine. The god of sake, Miki, was honored in rituals, where intoxication was a way of communing with spirits. Imagine emperors and priests swaying gently during a ceremony, not disgraced but sanctified, their blurred vision interpreted as glimpses of the other world. Of course, by the time of the Tokugawa shoguns, political power shifted away from emperors, but sake still flavored the throne's ceremonies. Even when emperors had little real authority, their role as sacred drinkers continued. The cups filled and emptied as markers of tradition. You sit now in a wooden hall, the emperor's presence serene, the soft notes of a koto strumming in the background. A servant warms the sake, pours it into a tiny porcelain cup, and places it in your hands. The liquid is smooth, clear, and slightly sweet, its warmth radiating outward like the first rays of dawn. For a moment, you understand. This isn't just drinking, it's ritual, identity, and the delicate thread connecting heaven, earth, and crown. The lesson lingers in the quiet after your sip. For Japanese emperors, sake wasn't about brawls or spectacle. It was about embodying divinity, binding people and gods together with every careful, moonlit cup. The lantern-lit courtyards of Japan fade, and now you find yourself wandering beneath red lacquered gates and into the grandeur of an imperial Chinese palace. Bronze bells chime, silk rustles, and servants shuffle forward carrying jade cups filled with fragrant rice wine. The aroma is heady sweet, yeasty, faintly floral. Here in China, emperors didn't just drink for pleasure. They turned wine into poetry, philosophy, and sometimes dangerous excess. Alcohol had been central to Chinese court life since antiquity. Bronze vessels from the Shang dynasty show kings and nobles, pouring ritual libations, their carved inscriptions, mixing prayers with reminders to drink. By the Han dynasty, rice wine was firmly entrenched in imperial banquets. You picture an emperor in dragon robes raising a jade goblet, while scholars and generals bow low, waiting for their turn to sip. Historians still argue whether emperors drank to genuine intoxication, or simply performed the ritual for show, but either way, the symbolism was powerful. Wine made the court a family. Bound by liquid loyalty, here's a quirky tidbit: early Chinese wine was often cloudy and thick, sometimes flavored with herbs or even flowers. Chrysanthemum wine, brewed for autumn festivals, was thought to prolong life. Imagine an emperor sipping delicately, petals floating in his cup, convinced he cheated death with every swallow. The Tang dynasty in particular turned wine into art. Poets like Li Bai immortalized drunkenness in verses recited at banquets, and emperors themselves joined in. Li Bai supposedly claimed he wrote his best work while tipsy, and stories tell of him drowning after drunkenly trying to embrace the moon's reflection in a river. Whether true or not, his legend spread through imperial halls, linking intoxication to genius. You can almost see an emperor quoting Li Bai between hiccups, trying to prove that his tipsiness was actually brilliance in disguise. Emperor Xuanzong of Tang famously hosted lavish night banquets where wine flowed alongside music and dancing. He doted on his beloved consort Yang Gaifai, whose presence, paired with rivers of wine, became a symbol of the dynasty's decadence. Historians still debate whether their indulgence weakened the throne or whether later chroniclers exaggerated it to blame them for the empire's troubles. But in the candlelit haze, jade cups clinking, it's easy to imagine how the line between romance and rouen blurred. Quirky fringe detail. Some emperors believed in wine immortality elixirs, brews, mixed with minerals like gold or mercury. You grimace as you sip, realizing that instead of granting eternal life, these concoctions probably shortened it. Alchemy often crossed into winemaking, and while the emperors hoped for transcendence, what they really got was heavy metal poisoning with a hangover chaser. The Ming dynasty carried on the tradition with grand palace banquets. Foreign envoys were plied with cup after cup of baijiu, a fiery spirit distilled from grain. One Jesuit missionary described it as liquid flame, strong enough to fell even the hardiest drinkers. You take a tentative sip and cough violently, eyes watering, while Chinese courtiers politely pretend not to laugh. To survive in the Forbidden City, you needed both diplomacy and a strong liver dot, and then there's the etiquette. At court banquets, refusing a toast could be taken as an insult. Imagine a nervous official, already dizzy after 10 rounds, forced to keep drinking lest he appear disrespectful. The emperor watches, amused, knowing that every drained cup is both loyalty and submission. But alcohol was also tied to governance. Some emperors issued bans during times of famine, arguing grain was better used for food. Others ignored the rules and kept drinking regardless. The push and pull between indulgence and morality shaped dynasties as much as any battle. You find yourself now in a moonlit pavilion, listening to zithers as a servant pours golden wine into a jade cup. The emperor raises his, smiling faintly, while poets scribble verses and dancers whirl. Every sip feels heavy with centuries of ritual. Rebellion, poetry, and peril dot the lesson glows faintly like the lantern light in China. Drinking wasn't just about indulgence, it was about weaving culture, art, and even empire itself into the bottom of a cup. The moonlit pavilions of China dissolve, and you find yourself surrounded by lush gardens perfumed with roses and jasmine. Marble fountains splash, courtiers in jeweled turbans lounge on silken cushions, and silver trays of goblets filled with ruby-red wine glitter in the torchlight. You're in the mule courts of India, where emperors wrapped themselves in luxury, mixing strict religion with surprising indulgence, and where wine perfumed with spices flowed through evenings of poetry, music, and intrigue. The mules descended from Central Asian conquerors, and their taste for alcohol was complex. Islamic law forbade it, yet emperors often bent the rule in practice. Babur, the first mule emperor, wrote in his memoirs of wine-filled gatherings in Kabul and India, only to later swear off drinking when it harmed his health. Historians still argue whether his abstinence was sincere or merely rhetorical, but in those early feasts, you can already see a dynasty grappling with both devotion and desire. His grandson Akbar the Great, famed for his tolerance, reportedly disliked alcohol personally, but permitted others to drink at court. He even built separate quarters for drinking parties, perhaps to keep indulgence at a safe distance from the throne. Yet Akbar loved experimentation. One quirky tidbit tells of him mixing exotic fruit juices into mocktails long before the term existed. You imagine a sober emperor hosting a feast where courtiers downed wine while he sipped mango blends, smiling knowingly. Then came Jahangir, Akbar's son, who embraced wine with abandon. Chronicles describe him downing dozens of cups a night, sometimes flavored with rosewater or saffron, his evenings a blur of intoxication and indulgence. His empress, Noor Jahan, was said to manage affairs of state when Jahangir was too drunk to function a partnership both scandalous and pragmatic. Historians still debate the extent of his excess, but the image of a ruler stumbling from goblet to goblet, while his queen quietly ran the empire, lingers powerfully. And here's a quirky fringe detail. Jahangir supposedly kept records of his drinking habits as if they were state business, noting how many cups he consumed daily. Imagine an emperor turning alcoholism into an official ledger entry, 3 cups rose-infused. For saffron, to plain policy decisions pending sobriety. Shah Jahan, builder of the Taj Mahal, inherited this culture of indulgence but leaned more toward opium than alcohol. Still, court feasts under his reign featured rivers of wine for nobles, poets, and musicians. You picture dancers twirling by, torchlight, goblets lifted in rhythm while the emperor gazed dreamily into the distance. Historians still argue whether his relatively restrained personal habits marked a shift, or whether the image of piety was carefully curated while wine still flowed freely. For everyone else, Aurangzeb, his son, famously swung the pendulum hard. In the other direction, devoutly religious, he banned alcohol entirely from his court, smashing goblets and punishing drinkers. But bans rarely stopped desire. Secret cellars bubbled with wine, and courtiers whispered of clandestine feasts. The contrast is sharp. A pious emperor trying to purify his empire, while his subjects clung to the heady allure of forbidden drink. The mule drinking culture even influenced art. Miniature paintings depict emperors lounging with cups, surrounded by attendants, vines, and fountains. In some, the wine looks almost glowing, a symbol of abundance. Others hint at the melancholy of overindulgence, figures slumped, eyes heavy, goblets abandoned mid-toast. You lean in and realize these weren't just paintings. They were warnings and celebrations all at once. Quirky tidbit? Mule wines were often imported from Persia or Central Asia, infused with rose, cardamom, or musk. Imagine sipping a goblet that tastes like a perfume bottle, luxurious, overwhelming, and oddly dizzying. the drink itself became a sensual experience. Another layer of extravagance in a court already drowning in jewels and silk. So you sit now on a velvet cushion, cup of rose-scented wine in hand, as musicians plug sitars and poets recite verses about love and eternity. Across the garden, the emperor raises his own goblet, a figure caught between divine law and human desire. And you understand, in the mule courts, alcohol wasn't just indulgence, it was theatre, conflict, and sometimes the very thing that blurred the line between greatness and ruin. The perfumed mule gardens fade, and now you hear the gentle clink of ice cubes, the fizz of tonic, and the clatter of crystal in polished 20th century palaces. The air no longer smells of incense or rosewater, it smells of gin, vermouth, and a discreet dash of scandal. You've stepped into the world of modern royals, where cocktails replace casks, and behind the carefully choreographed photographs of duty and dignity, bar carts quietly roll into drawing rooms. In Britain, gin became the quiet star of royal evenings. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was famously fond of a gin and dubbinate to parts dubbinate. 1 part gin, a slice of lemon. She reportedly drank it daily, sometimes before lunch, sometimes before bed. Historians still argue whether her intake was as heavy as gossip suggested, or whether her long life she made it to 101 proved that gin and fortified wine were her secret tonic. Either way, the association stuck. The smiling grandmother of the monarchy, glass in hand, winking at the world. Her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, was said to enjoy a cocktail too often, a simple gin and doublet like her mother, or sometimes a dry martini. One quirky tidbit: at state banquets, while guests downed multiple wines, the Queen usually stuck to 1 or 2 measured glasses. Ever the professional, she kept her composure, but insiders whispered that her pre-dinner gin and doublet was a ritual not to be missed. You picture her steadying herself before greeting heads of state, the quiet hum of juniper berries warming her resolve. And then there's Princess Margaret, Elizabeth's sister, who became legendary for her indulgence. Her daily routine, recorded by biographers, included a vodka pick-me-up around noon, followed by wine at lunch, porter for PM, and whiskey into the night. Was every detail accurate? Or did tabloids exaggerate? Historians still debate. But the image of Margaret with a cigarette in one hand and a glass in the other defined her as the rebel royal, more bohemian than dutiful. Across the Channel, other monarchies embraced cocktails too. King Boudewijn of Belgium was said to enjoy wine quietly, while the Dutch royals became associated with Geneva, a Dutch gin that predated London's versions. You raise a tulip glass of it, sharp and malty, and understand why it endured as a northern favorite. Quirky detail: in Monaco, Prince Rainier III and Princess Grace hosted Hollywood-style cocktail parties in their palace, complete with champagne. Towers, the blend of royalty and celebrity created a new image, kings and queens as glamorous hosts, with glasses sparkling under flashbulbs. Theirs wasn't a medieval feast, it was a cocktail hour dressed in diamonds. But modern royals also faced a problem older kings never worried about: paparazzi. A medieval monarch could drink himself silly with only chroniclers to spread rumors. A 20th century royal risked being photographed mid-sip. You imagine the tension, balancing a martini glass with perfect posture, knowing tomorrow's headlines might turn a second round into a scandal. And here's another quirky fringe note: royal doctors often recommended moderate alcohol for health. Well, into the 20th century, the Queen Mother herself supposedly credited gin and tonic with warding off malaria during wartime. You chuckle at the thought. Doctor's orders, she might say, sipping elegantly from her glass. Behind all the glitter, though, the same pattern echoes. Alcohol served as relaxation, diplomacy, and ritual. State banquets featured endless courses of paired wines, but private evenings were quieter, more intimate. Royals leaned on their favorite drinks the way ancient kings leaned on mead horns, or jade cups, different vessels, same comfort. So here you sit in a polished drawing room, ice clinking in your glass, portraits of ancestors frowning down from the walls. A butler offers you another round, and you wonder how much history has really changed. The thrones may be constitutional now, the crowns lighter, but the bar carts are still stocked. And somewhere, in the quiet of a palace evening, another monarch raises a cocktail to the strange, enduring marriage of crown and cup. The ice clinks fade, and now you hear the pounding of boots on parade grounds, the roar of propaganda loudspeakers, and the pop of corks at victory banquets. You've stepped into the 20th century's darker palaces, those of dictators, who crowned themselves in fear and drank like kings. The uniforms may differ, the palaces less gilded, but the same truth bubbles. Power and intoxication still walk hand in hand. Take Joseph Stalin. Accounts from Kremlin insiders describe nights where vodka flowed like rivers. Toasts dragged on for hours, and no one dared leave the table until Stalin dismissed them. Guests often staggered out at dawn, exhausted, stomachs burning, while Stalin himself seemed immune, coolly puffing on his pipe between sips. Historians still argue whether he actually drank heavily or pretended to sip, while forcing everyone else under the table. Either way, the ritual served its purpose. Vodka wasn't just a drink, it was a test of loyalty. Here's a quirky tidbit. One survivor recalled that Stalin loved to demand increasingly absurd toasts, forcing generals and ministers to invent flattery while half-conscious. Imagine being ordered to toast to the radiant wisdom of Stalin's mustache after your 10th shot. Your career on the line if you slurred. It's funny until you realize mistakes could mean exile, or worse, a cross. The ocean, Fidel Castro cultivated his own boozy image, though with rum instead of vodka. Rum was Cuba's pride, and Castro made it part of his revolutionary persona. He often entertained foreign guests with cigars in one hand and a glass of Havana Club in the other. Was it genuine enjoyment or clever branding? Historians still debate. But the association stuck. Rum and revolution became inseparable in the Cuban imagination. Then there's Adolf Hitler, who broke the pattern entirely. Famously, he was a teetotaler, despising alcohol, calling it poison. Yet his inner circle drank heavily, often while he lectured soberly. Some argue his abstinence only sharpened the aura of discipline around him, while his officers grew loose-lipped. Under the influence, you can almost picture him frowning at Göring's flushed cheeks, the Reichstag echoing with the smell of spilled beer. Mussolini, on the other hand, embraced wine culture as part of his new Roman Empire. He promoted Italian vintages as national pride, and though he claimed moderation, plenty of witnesses recalled him enjoying nightly rounds. Quirky detail, he reportedly insisted wine made Italians stronger, more virile, even more patriotic, turning intoxication into propaganda. Imagine posters of farmers raising goblets beside fascist slogans. Wine literally weaponized as ideology. Even smaller dictators played the part. Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania demanded endless toasts of plum brandy at official dinners, leaving foreign dignitaries reeling. Kim Jong-il of North Korea was rumored to import crates of Hennessy cognac by the case, his tastes leaning more Versailles than Pyongyang austerity. Historians still argue whether the amounts were exaggerated by defectors, but the imagery of a dictator sipping French brandy while his people starved remains powerful. And here's another fringe tidbit: some Cold War leaders deliberately staged drunken scenes to test foreign diplomats. In Moscow, vodka shots weren't just hospitality. They were weapons. Outlast your host and you won respect. Collapse first, and your country looked weak. You can almost hear the unspoken rules, diplomacy by drink. Alliances forged and broken over the contents of a bottle. The continuity strikes you hard. These weren't kings in crowns, yet they mimicked monarchy in every way. Lavish banquets, endless goblets, drinking as spectacle and control. Alcohol became theater, propaganda, even intimidation. Behind the modern uniforms, the same old goblets, CLINKED. So you sit at a long Soviet table, vodka stinging your throat, the general secretary's cold eyes fixed on you as he demands yet another toast. The lesson is sharp as the liquor. Whether crowned by birth or by coup, rulers used drink to test, to charm, to dominate, and history, ever thirsty, wrote it all down. The Kremlin's smoke clears, and now you drift into quieter rooms, less glitter, fewer roaring toasts, more uneasy silence. These are the places where some royals and rulers finally pushed their goblets away, realizing that the crown weighed heavier with each sip. Not every story ends in fountains of wine or barrels of beer. Some kings and queens, surprisingly, tried to sober up. Take George IV of Britain, often remembered as one of the drunkest monarchs in European history. In his youth, he downed brandy and port like water, his waistline and scandals swelling together. But as he aged, ravaged by gout and obesity, he made half-hearted attempts to cut back. Historians still argue whether he genuinely sought sobriety or merely switched from hard liquor to lighter wines. Either way, his efforts came too late. His reign was marred by the damage drink had already done. Quirky tidbit: doctors prescribed him watered-down brandy for health, which is like prescribing cookies to cure diabetes. You can almost hear him groaning in his chambers, promising to quit tomorrow, then raising another glass before the physician's ink dried elsewhere. Some royals succeeded better. King Edward VII, though known for indulgence, tried to moderate his drinking toward the end of his life, claiming he needed a clearer head for diplomacy. Did it make much difference? Historians debate, but at least he tried, exchanging towering goblets for more measured glasses. In Russia, Tsar Alexander III made a point of contrasting himself with his drunken predecessors. Unlike Catherine's vodka-soaked court, he styled himself as sober, disciplined, even austere. But insiders whispered he still enjoyed beer in moderation, often sipping with his soldiers. Was it temperance or clever rebranding? The truth probably sits somewhere in the foam of his mug. And then there's Queen Victoria again, whose private brandy habits never blossomed into public scandal. She maintained an image of restraint while indulging quietly, proving that sometimes moderation was as political as excess. Fringe example: some monarchs even embraced the temperance movement. In the 19th century, King Oscar II of Sweden cautiously supported restrictions on public drinking, aware of the dangers of nationwide alcoholism. Imagine a king preaching restraint while his subjects grumbled, tankards in hand, balancing morality. And monarchy was never easy, yet rehab, at least in the modern sense, was rare. Monarchs weren't sent off to clinics, they were shielded, indulged. Their struggles whispered in corridors rather than splashed in papers. Still, the shadow of alcohol haunted them. You sense it in diaries and letters, confessions of fatigue, resolutions to quit, regrets scribbled between sips. And here's a quirky twist: some rulers used abstinence as a brand. Sultan Murad IV of the Ottomans banned alcohol altogether, parading his sobriety as moral strength, though, as you remember, rumors claimed he drank in secret. The paradox lingers: sobriety itself could be weaponized, just as intoxication was. So you sit in a dim royal chamber now, the goblets pushed aside, the air heavy with the smell of extinguished candles. A king leans back, sighing, declaring tomorrow will be different. Whether he means it or not doesn't matter. The point is clear: even thrones groan under the weight of excess. And sometimes the only crown left to wear is sobriety. The lesson drifts in like a quiet toast. Some rulers tried to sober up, to reclaim clarity. Some succeeded, some failed. But the effort itself reveals the truth: alcohol was never just a luxury. It was a burden, one not even kings and queens could escape. The dim royal chamber fades, and now you stand at the crossroads of it all, palaces echoing with laughter, mead halls roaring with boasts, vodka-soaked banquets grinding into dawn. From Mesopotamian beer sipped through straws to modern royals with gin and dubonnet, one thread binds it all together: the crown has always tilted when the goblet is raised. Think back: Cleopatra reclining with honeyed wine, Alexander the Great daring his generals to outdrink him, Louis XIV staging fountains of claret in Versailles, Catherine the Great watching courtiers collapse under endless toasts. Each ruler used alcohol as symbol, tool, or shield. Some claimed it linked them to gods, others wielded it to bind soldiers or seduce allies, while a few simply drowned their sorrows in it. Historians still argue whether these indulgences strengthened their rule through spectacle or weakened it through excess, but either way, Drink shaped the rhythm of power dot, and the quirks linger. Ferrers swallowing chunky beer like liquid bread. Viking queens pouring mead as sacred ritual. Mule emperors recording their wine intake like state decrees. Ottoman sultans waging wars partly to secure vineyards. Modern royals hiding cocktails. Behind polished composure, each sip, no matter how strange, told a story of humanity beneath the crown. Even today, the legacy spills on. Champagne still whispers of Versailles. Scotch still conjures Highland halls. Sake still ties the living to the divine in Japan. Rum still sails with echoes of pirate queens. Alcohol outlived its kings and queens, but it keeps their shadows alive. In every toast, you take a breath and imagine the thrones themselves, dented not just by the weight of crowns, but by the endless goblets set beside them. Rule is lonely, heavy, impossible, but history shows again and again, few monarchs bore it without help from the bottle. So, you set down your cup now, the long journey complete. The echoes of drunk rulers fade into silence, and the lesson rests. Gently, power is intoxicating enough on its own, but mixed with alcohol, it becomes both glittering and tragic. And now, with the halls quiet and the goblets empty, it's time to let the story settle. You've wandered through mead halls, palaces, and gardens. You've tasted everything from soupy Egyptian beer to fiery Russian vodka. And you've watched kings and queens rise, stumble, and sometimes fall with cups in hand. But here, at the edge of the tale, the pace softens. The candles burn lower, they glow warm and steady. The noise of feasts fades into a distant murmur, like waves lapping a faraway shore. You let your shoulders relax, your breath slow, your eyes grow heavier. Those rulers you met laughing, boasting, collapsing under the weight of their indulgence, they're only shadows now. Flickering memories tucked safely back into the folds of history. In this stillness, the story becomes gentle. The clink of cups becomes the hush of wind in the trees. The heavy banquet tables melt away, leaving only the calm image of a quiet garden under the moon. A single cup rests on the stone beside you, but you don't need to lift it. Just knowing it's there is enough. You feel your body settle deeper, as if you too have found a throne simple, soft, and perfectly your own. The grand excesses of the past no longer demand your attention. All that matters is the slow rhythm of your breathing, steady and calm, like the heartbeat of a peaceful world. So close your eyes. Let the echoes of history drift away. Imagine soft footsteps retreating down a candlelit corridor, doors closing gently, silence wrapping you like a blanket. The kings and queens are gone, their cups emptied, their crowns set aside, and here you are, safe, still, ready for rest. Sleep well.